The question that we ought to be asking, I think, is the question that I raised a moment ago when I asked you to think about your friend. What is it that actually lives or dies? And, two separate questions, what is it that really matters to us in death? And I suggest that there's two defensible answers to this question, or at least defensible to different parts of the question, perhaps I'll ultimately argue. One answer is the human organism, right? We are an animal, essentially, if you like. The definition talked about the animal and vital functions. Well, we are animals. We know that biologically we are animals. So the human organism we can see as a living animal organism, even if the brain has ceased to function and that living organism is only being maintained artificially, as in the case of the pregnant woman. She still, I think, is clearly a living human organism. And if you want to ask, when does the human organism die, then it was really the traditional definition that was the right one. When the heart stops beating, the blood stops circulating, the loss of the animal functions, vital functions, or in John Cleese's language, when you're a stiff, or if you like in Griesser and Boyle's language, when decomposition begins to set in, even though you might not be able to tell that for some hours or days, but effectively that's what you're talking about. That's when the organism dies. But is that really what matters about death? That's the next question. So here's again a defense of the traditional view about what ought to matter or what we ought to take into account when considering whether it's wrong to end a patient's life. This is an article written about a legal decision in Britain in a case called the Bland case. I'll give you some details about the Bland case in just a moment. But let's look at this first. So John Keehan here is saying that the traditional medical ethical view never asks whether the patient's life is worthwhile. For the notion of a worthless life is as alien to the Hippocratic tradition as it is to the English criminal law, both of which subscribe to the principle of the sanctity of life. So what John Keehan is saying is the traditional view is not interested in questions about quality of life. It doesn't go into that question. It doesn't ask whether life is worthwhile or not. It just says, do you have a living human being? If you do, then all human lives are intrinsically valuable, and it's always wrong intentionally to kill an innocent human being. So on that view, you would be defending the idea that if you have a living human organism, you mustn't ask about the quality of the life. It's wrong to end its life. And of course, it follows that on that view, it would be wrong to remove its heart, because that's about what you're about to do. Now, let's look to clarify the sort of issues we're talking about. Let's just look at a brain scan about what we're talking about. Here we have a healthy human being with a lot of... The colour, by the way, as it says down here, shows the amount of glucose metabolised per 100 grams of brain tissue, but you needn't really worry too much about the medical details. Here you have, and you show the scale, so the lighter colours, the greens, yellows and reds, show more activity going on. So this is a healthy person. This is someone who is brain dead. There's no glucose metabolism being metabolised in the brain itself. In that area. And this is someone who is in what's called a persistent vegetative state, which I'm going to start talking about in a moment because it raises the question that I want to address, where there is some, but a low level of metabolism going on. So there is some brain activity, but there may be, this is compatible with the destruction of the cortex and therefore the loss of all consciousness. So here's the case that I mentioned a moment ago of Tony Bland. Tony Bland was a 17-year-old football fan in England who wanted to see his team play in his hometown of Sheffield. It was a very important game. There was a big crowd trying to get into the game. There were some hold-ups in letting them in, and the crowd had to pass through a tunnel in order to get to the stands. And tragically, because of this large crowd trying to get in. People fell over, and more people didn't see that other people couldn't get out of the tunnel at the other end, and people piled up, and a lot of people got suffocated on the bottom of this, what ended up being a pile-up of fans trying to get into the stadium. And something like 95 people died, the greatest sporting tragedy in British history. Tony Bland was one of the people trying to get in. He did not die at that time, but he was without oxygen for some time. So when the rescue workers got in there, pulled out people, they found him still breathing. They took him to hospital, but he never recovered consciousness. And after he had been in hospital for, I don't remember exactly, but I think more than a year, doctors said, examining his brain, said there was no prospect of him ever recovering consciousness. And the parents said that they did not wish him to be kept alive. He was alive, right? Nobody was saying he was brain dead. He definitely had some brain functions. He was like the third brain scan there at the end. So the parents applied to have the feeding tube removed. Because he was not brain dead, but was only in a persistent vegetative state, his brain stem was functioning, and he did not need to be in a respirator. His brain stem was regulating his breathing, but he couldn't eat. He had no swallow reflex, so he was being fed through a tube into his stomach. So the parents said, can we remove the tube? Knowing, of course, that then he will die through lack of food and fluids. The hospital was unsure about the legal status of this, and because there was an inquiry going on into the deaths at the football stadium, they asked the coroner who was leading the inquiry, and the coroner said, this is a grey area, you better apply to a court for permission to do this. So the case went to the court. It started off at a low level of court, and the British government, the British Attorney General equivalent, decided to appeal because of the public interest in the decision. The next level, the Court of Appeal, the lowest level said, yes, you can pull out the feeding tube. They went to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal said the same thing, and the government appealed again. So they went to the highest court in Britain, which at the time was known as the House of Lords, not the upper house of Parliament, but the law courts. So this is the court also decided that the feeding tube could be withdrawn. And it's interesting that actually this decision was unanimous at all levels. So at the lowest level there was one judge, I think at the next level there was 3, and at the highest level there was 5. So 9 judges in all, unanimous view that it was permissible to remove the feeding tube. Here is one of them, perhaps the most clear cut in his language, but the others basically agreed. To an individual with no cognitive capacity whatever and no prospect of ever recovering any such capacity in this world, it must be a matter of complete indifference whether he lives or dies. So basically they were saying, more or less as I suggested when I asked you to think about your friend, if somebody has irreversibly lost consciousness, they have no interest in continuing to live. There is nothing that can really matter to them because they'll never be conscious again. And if somebody has no interest in continuing to live, you don't have to maintain his life. So that was the decision here. And it's an answer, therefore, to that question I asked of what matters. The highest court in Britain said what matters in death is at least consciousness. They didn't exactly say the survival of the person, but they said there has to be consciousness or there is nothing that matters about death if there is no consciousness. So you could say consciousness is a minimal requirement for being a person rather than being an organism. And that was an interesting and quite bold decision, which remains the law in Britain today and is acted on. Now, the United States has dealt with this slightly differently, and I'll just briefly refer to this case. The leading case here is the case of Nancy Beth Cruzan, who was injured in an automobile accident and was also in persistent vegetative state. She was in that state for some time, again for years, when her parents asked for the life support to be withdrawn, for, again, the feeding tube to be withdrawn. This was in the state of Missouri. The court in Missouri said, yes, a competent person can ask for life support to be withdrawn, but she is not a competent person. We would need evidence that she would not have wished to continue to live in this state before we can say that it is permissible to withdraw the feeding tube. So, in other words, the court was trying to rather say, we want to find out what she would want. And only then, if we can have some evidence that she would have wanted to have the feeding tube withdrawn, can we do it. The family appealed, and the case went to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court essentially said, well, this is really up to the states. The states can decide what criteria to use in when to withdraw feeding tubes. So they sent it back to the state Supreme Court in Missouri, but they said you should open the inquiry as to whether there is any evidence as to whether Nancy Beth Cruzan would or would not have wanted to go on living in this state. Well, this is now, I think, some 7 years after the accident occurred. But what do you know? Some of her friends come forward to the court and say, yes, I had a conversation with Nancy in which we talked about a case of somebody who was in a persistent vegetative state, and she said, I would never want to go on living if I were in that state, or words to that effect. So 2 people testified to the court that they had heard her say that, and the court then duly authorised the withdrawal of her life support, and she died. Her family gave her this gravestone, which I think is interesting. It gives her date of birth. It gives the date that she departed, which is the date of her accident, 1983, and it says, at peace, 1990, 7 years later. So the family clearly thought, and I think correctly, in line with what I was saying, they lost their daughter, their sister, their aunt in 1983 when she had the accident, not in 1990 when she finally died. And I think there's lessons for that in terms of the answer to the question, what matters and what doesn't matter in brain death.